Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hey, welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm your host today, Ed History 101, and joining me today is Matt Ehrlich. And Matt, I'm super thrilled you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be talking about your book with a very long, lovely title that I don't have in front of me, which is like a cardinal sin for podcasters. So,
Well, I'll read it for you. It's called The Krebiozen Hoax: How a Mysterious Cancer Drug Shook Organized Medicine.
excellent. So why don't we start with you? So what was your path to doing history, to kind of uncovering the particular topic and the people you go into in your book?
Sure. Well, I'm not a professional full-time historian. I'm a retired journalism professor, but I've always been interested ever since I was a kid. My dad actually had a doctorate in history, and he taught art history. My mom taught theater history, among other things. My brother was into history, so it's just always something that I've been interested in, and I've read a lot of nonfiction historical accounts. And how I got interested in this topic specifically was the previous book that I had done was a book about academic freedom, actually. It was called Dangerous Ideas on Campus, and it dealt with a couple of academic freedom cases in the 1960s at the university I spent most of my career at, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And in the process of researching that book, I learned about this whole Krebiozen saga, which also profoundly affected the University of Illinois. It actually happened the main time that it affected the University of Illinois, or what we call here the U of I. So if I say the U of I, that's what I'm referring to. Um, the whole Krebiozen affair affected the U of I in the 1950s. It led to the ouster of the university president, and that kind of set the stage for what my previous book had been about, which covered a slightly later time period. But I decided that the whole Krebiozen affair deserved a book of its own, even though I was, as I said, I'm not a professional historian. I also, even though I did work in journalism and taught journalism for many years, I didn't have any particular expertise in science or medicine. But it was just a really interesting story, and I've always been interested in stories. That's, I think, what really attracts me to history. It's just a really interesting saga with interesting characters. And just to sum up this whole thing very, very quickly, the Krebiozen hoax is a story about a what turned out to be a phony cancer drug, but it was backed by a really prominent administrator and physiologist associated with the University of Illinois, specifically their medical programs in Chicago, a guy named Andrew Ivy, who was approached by a couple of Yugoslavian brothers who said that they had a cancer drug that would be really, really effective. Turned out the drug was not effective, but this prominent physiologist and University of Illinois administrator stuck with the drug for years and years and years and years, even after it was rejected by everyone from the American Medical Association to the Food and Drug Administration and the National Cancer Institute. Eventually, there was a criminal fraud trial in which the prominent physiologist and his Yugoslavian collaborators were all acquitted, and the drug Krebiozen disappeared and was pretty much never heard from again. But it was a really big deal in its time, and that's why I wanted to write about it.
One of my favorite pictures in the book is, I think it's Ivy surrounded by all the women who
Mhm.
claim to be saved by the drug, and just kind of how people were so ride or die for the medication and defending the medication. But kind of before we get into that, though, I'd really be curious about your thoughts about the difference between journalism, about writing journalism and doing history. Is it simply a matter of time? Like, history is journalism in the past? Like, what do you see as the difference or the similarities between doing quote unquote journalism and doing history?
Well, for me, I don't know that there's a great big difference. I mean, The cliche about journalism, which I think has been perpetuated by journalists themselves, is that it's the first rough draft of history. And so, they're closely aligned in that sense. Journalism is tied to the present. It's literally rooted in the du jour, the news of the day. That's the jour in journalism. Whereas history is focused more on the past and takes a longer point of view. But to me, the great similarity between the two is that it's both a form of storytelling. Not all journalism is rooted in story. There are many different forms of journalism. And history, I know, isn't always rooted in telling a good story. Probably some professional journalists would say, if you're more interested in telling a good story than being a careful historian, that can lead you down a bad path. But to me, they've got more in common, journalism and history, than they have differences.
Yeah, true, true. One of the first things you do when you start your book, you start off by thanking archivists, and you allude to the fact you wrote a pandemic book, that it was written kind of the depths or the lows or the deepest part of the pandemic. And I'm wondering if you could say more about your process for working in the archives, as someone who started with journalism and is now engaging in history, and how you decided which archives to focus on, and how your archival work came about.
Yeah, in terms of which archives to consult, it was simply where the personal papers of some of the protagonists was. For example, this guy, Andrew Ivy, the physiologist and University of Illinois administrator, who's probably the central figure in the story. His papers somehow, and I still am not exactly sure how this happened, but they ended up at an archive at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, an actually really good archive. And the name of it, I believe it's the American Heritage Center, off the top of my head, but it is listed in the acknowledgments. And so I spent some time in Laramie, Wyoming at this archive. Um, Gloria Swanson, the movie actress, the star of Sunset Boulevard, Norma Desmond, she was a big proponent of this drug and a big backer of this drug. And her papers ended up at the Harry Ransom Center, which is a major archive at the University of Texas at Austin. The Food and Drug Administration, which I mentioned very briefly at the outset, their records are at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. So those are just a few of the places that I ended up going just because that was where the major stuff was. One other real quick mention is Senator Paul Douglas, who was a U.S. Senator from Illinois, also a major player and a major backer of this drug. His papers are at the Chicago History Museum in Chicago. So I was there and also at the University of Illinois Archives in both Champaign-Urbana and Chicago. So it was simply where the necessary primary documents were. That's what guided my research. I love archives. I think they're wonderful places. I've always enjoyed going on site to archives to work on historical projects, in part because they're often located in really cool places like the Washington, D.C. area. I wrote one book where I was able to do research in New York City, research in Madison, Wisconsin at the State Historical Society there. And even going to a place like Laramie, Wyoming, where I'd never been before, it was just cool to visit a place I hadn't seen and to go around the campus there. And I made a special point about thanking archivists because, especially in connection with this book, most of the on site research was done 2021 and 2022. So the immediate aftermath of the worst of the pandemic. And the folks who were working in those archives were working under really trying circumstances. Working with a whole bunch of different people, where everyone was masked, where people were out sick or being quarantined, and just working under really tough constraints. I'm always thankful to archivists, but I was especially thankful this time. And as far as the process that I use for archives, I just try to take my phone, use it as a camera, photograph as much stuff as I possibly can to maximize the time that I'm there. Because although I like visiting archives, it can be expensive to do, lengthy on-site research. So I've gotten to the point where I just photograph everything that I think might be helpful, do it page by page. When I'm done with that, sometimes at the motel or wherever else I'm staying that evening, I'll transfer it from my phone to a laptop, collate it into a scrollable PDF file, and then arrange those in a cloud storage system and back everything up. And so that's the best way that I've found for maximizing the amount of time that I have, the limited amount of time necessarily that I have in archives.
And I think you didn't say it directly, but I think one of the things that's amazing about archives and archivists is that they're open to the public. Yes, you have to make an appointment, but you don't have to have academic credentials. And
Mhm.
anyone can go to an archive, which is such a fantastic thing. And just to kind of narrow in on a detail, one of the things that really kind of caught my eye and my ear is that you say at one point, someone in a meeting, one of the Hungarians says the word stop, but he pronounced it in a very particular way. How did you find that detail in the archive? Like, did someone record or did you listen to an audio recording of the meeting?
Well, just to give a little background of the specific thing that you're asking about, there was this doctor from Montenegro, what was then called Yugoslavia. Stefan Durovic was his name. He was the guy who invented this supposed cancer drug called Krebiozen, brought it to America, and somehow was able to ensnare Andrew Ivy, this physiologist, a very prominent doctor, and get his backing for the drug. Stefan Durovic's brother, Marko Durovic, also came to the United States. They came by way of Argentina. It was just a really bizarre story. Juan Perón's government was involved. Just really bizarre details associated with this. And so Marko Durovic came, and during a very tense meeting with the representatives of the American Medical Association about this drug and what it actually was and how it was made, Marko Durovic apparently said in a very dramatic tone of voice one of the few English words he knew, which was stop, except he pronounced it as stop. So,
And
and
all the gravitas associated with that. Yeah.
yeah, and the conversation sort of deteriorated it from there. But I learned about that through secondary sources from a pro-Krebiozen writer who wrote a history from a very pro-Krebiozen point of view about the development of the drug. And then there's no audio recording of this meeting, but someone who was present provided an affidavit, a legal affidavit. And the record of that affidavit was in Andrew Ivy's papers at the University of Wyoming, where this guy, this doctor who was present, recounted blow by blow the details that had happened. So that's one of the things about doing on-site research is that you can uncover um, really fun, if that's the right word, fun details that add some color and help enhance the storytelling and give a sense of you actually having been there.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, it's even though it's a legal document, it came from an affidavit. It's not an audio recording. It's possible it didn't happen 100% the way that the affidavit said it happened, but that was how I cited it formally in the endnotes in the book.
We have this human need to cast people in the human, the written record as good people or bad people. And there's something kind of reassuring about saying, this person was a good person and this was a bad person. If we were to kind of weigh the scales, there are all these ways in which Ivy was objectively a bad person. He was pushing a drug that did not do what he said it did. But on the other hand, Ivy did a whole number of things that were good, for science, for academia, for medicine. So we don't want to categorize him as good or bad. But I'm curious how your feelings about Ivy changed throughout the course of the book as you learned what he did or what he failed to do.
Yeah, my educational philosophy, both in terms of teaching and in research, I try to characterize it as constructive complication, in the sense that we can complicate our understanding of why other people act the way that they do in particular historical moments. And I say constructively because hopefully this process of complication can be done in a way that actually does justice to the historical record. So, in the case of Andrew Ivy, this guy, before he got ensnared by this Yugoslavian doctor and became involved with this phony cancer medication, Andrew Ivy was a big deal. That was the whole reason that the University of Illinois recruited him from Northwestern University. He was one of the world's most prominent physiologists. He was the designated spokesperson for medical ethics at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war doctors in 1946. Ivy had written at the height of the Cold War, advocating for racial justice in medicine and in medical education, arguing against discrimination against African Americans and against Jews. So he was an impressive person. He had attached his name to more than 1,000 medical papers. He had trained thousands of medical students. Um, so, on the whole, especially before he got involved with this drug, he was, I would argue, a really impressive person. But in not only getting involved with this drug, but especially in very stubbornly refusing to be budged from his support for it, he did a whole lot of damage. His supporters said, like, well, he didn't necessarily do any harm by backing this drug, but in fact, he did a lot of harm because not only was he backing a phony cancer medicine that was being backed by other people who were profiting um, to the tune of millions of dollars from it. Ivy, not so much, but other people made a whole lot of money from this phony cancer drug. So there was that problem with it. But there also was the problem that Ivy fed into a lot of conspiratorial thinking. The fact that, or he was arguing rather, and it was never proved, it never was proved as fact, that the American Medical Association was in league with a couple of businessmen to seize control of this drug. And the Food and Drug Administration and the National Cancer Institute, in their opposition to this drug, that just showed that these agencies should not be trusted. He's just doing a whole lot of damage to the whole institutional infrastructure behind organized science and medicine. And that totally violated his compact
Yeah,
as a science. You're really just trashing the whole. You're trashing your profession. You're trashing your life's mission just for the sake of backing this medicine. So, the balance of the historical record, I think, for Andrew Ivy is negative just for that. But I also came to the conclusion, and I didn't necessarily expect to come to this conclusion, that at the very, very end of his career, after he had been acquitted on fraud charges, but had been pretty much completely discredited as a doctor and a scientist, he still was dispensing a Krebiozen like drug, essentially a phony cancer drug. to people with terminal cancer, but he wasn't charging any money for it. And essentially, what I think he was doing was he was being approached by people who had no other hope, no other place to turn. And they came to him and said, I've heard that maybe you can help me. And he said, Here, take this. I think it'll make you feel better. You don't have to give me any money for it. And then they left and probably did feel a little bit better because this guy who looked like something out of Central Casting as the kindly country white haired doctor had listened to them, had taken their suffering seriously, had allowed them to do something proactive about their condition, and didn't ask for anything in return. So I think at the end of his career, he found a little bit of redemption, and it did raise broader questions in my mind, which I do try to get into at least a little bit at the start and the beginning of at the start and conclusion of the book
Mhm.
about this whole notion of hope in medicine and where we get hope from. And when organized medicine doesn't provide the hope that people need, then that's when the likes of quackery and the likes of Krebiozen arise and bad actors move in to profit. But when somebody offers hope to another person who otherwise can find no solace elsewhere and doesn't ask for anything in return, I think that's probably a good thing. I think that's probably a compassionate thing
Yeah.
and probably reflects well on Andrew Ivy's legacy. So, how do I see Andrew Ivy in the long run? I try to look at him in a constructively complicated sort of way. He was a really complicated individual, very smart, very hardworking, very stubborn, very ambitious in ways that got him into trouble. And his legacy is complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely is. And in the kind of the theme of complicated, we have a 20-year rule on our subreddit where we don't talk about history, well, events within the last 20 years. So we won't talk about ivermectin and the role that ivermectin played with hope during the depths of, of COVID for people. I'd like to think with Ivy, it wasn't just a matter of the money, that he became a defender of the medication because he believed there was, that there was a possibility of it helping, but it turns out it was creatine, which didn't really isn't a cure for cancer. So I'd like to think it wasn't just about the money for Ivy, but why do you think so many people were ride or die? I mean, to a point where a college president was unseated because of the medication. Why were so many people so ride or die for it? Was there a theme that emerged?
Well, first about Andrew Ivy, what his motivation was. I came to the conclusion that, as you say, it was not greed. And it wasn't that he had suffered a stroke or that he was succumbing to dementia or anything like that, or even that he was taken in completely by a master con artist, this Yugoslavian doctor and his brother. It seemed to be more a matter of Ivy's personal ambition, the fact that he really wanted to make a lasting contribution to science. And this drug seemed to be a promising way of treating cancer in a way that would be non invasive and non toxic. And there could be no greater contribution, even today, right? No greater contribution to science or medicine than coming up with a really effective, non toxic, non invasive treatment for cancer.
For sure.
Essentially, Ivy was looking at Krebiozen as a primitive form of immunotherapy, and immunotherapy is really hot in cancer treatment and research right now. So that's what seemed to be motivating him. And then when people like the AMA and other people in organized science and medicine started telling Ivy, look, this drug just doesn't work, he got very, very stubborn. And he just refused to be budged and said essentially, you're not going to tell me what to do. That can be a very positive thing in doing research, medical research sometimes. You know, You protect your independence, and in journalism too, by the way. You protect your editorial independence, you protect your scientific independence, and so forth. But you cannot cut yourself off entirely from the judgment of your professional peers. And that, unfortunately, is what Ivy did. As for everybody else, and yeah, I can understand not wanting to get into things like ivermectin or COVID or more recent things. But the reason I think this story is still relevant is because these same sorts of things keep happening over and over and over and over again,
Sure.
especially in connection with cancer, because we still do not have a cure for cancer. All these years later, after the Krebiozen affair, which happened in the 1950s and 1960s, um, the primary treatments still are radiation and chemo and surgery, and have all sorts of side effects that people are understandably leery of in a lot of cases. But I think, we still have a case, the situation when if organized medicine tells you, look, I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do for you. I don't want to give you false hope and make you think that you're going to come back from this, because the fact of the matter is, you're not going to. So in effect, there's really nothing else that I, as a representative of organized medicine, can do for you. I'm sorry, and by the way, before you leave, don't forget to pay your bill. Right?
Sure.
That's the reason I think that a lot of people, and I'm being purposefully exaggerated in terms of how organized medicine treats people, but that's the way it can be perceived in a lot of cases. When somebody, in contrast, comes to you and says, look, I've got something that isn't going to make you sick. I've got something that isn't going to involve you undergoing a scalpel. I think it's really promising in terms of making you feel better and helping you deal with your cancer in a productive sort of way. Um, I am providing you with hope that organized medicine cannot provide you. Then, yeah, a lot of people are going to gravitate toward that. And then when organized medicine says, with this unproven treatment, look, it doesn't work. We think it has no value. And not only that, we want to block your access to it, which is, in fact, what happened. The Food and Drug Administration started investigating Krebiozen, this phony cancer medicine, and blocked the interstate shipment of this drug. Then the people who are absolutely convinced that it is the only thing that is keeping them alive, or keeping their spouse alive, or keeping their child alive, of course they're going to react by saying, like, no, you cannot, you must not take this drug away from me. It is my only source of hope. I am absolutely convinced it's the only solution for me. Then it's just people acting in what they see as a perfectly rational manner and acting according to their own self-interest. So, in terms of the process of how of starting my research versus concluding my research, one conclusion I came to is that it isn't just dumb people who fall for something like Krebiozen or some of these other unproven medicines or disproven medicines. It's a lot of really well educated people, people from all across the political spectrum with all different forms of beliefs, who, for a variety of reasons, do not trust organized medicine, or if they trust organized medicine, believe that organized medicine no longer has anything to offer them for their own particular medical condition, like terminal cancer. And so they'll turn to something like Krebiozen and they'll say, look, it's my choice. I just want to have the ability to choose something like this and not be told that I cannot access something like this. You can do whatever you want. If you do not want to take this unproven medicine, that's fine. That's your right. But I want to have the right and the freedom to be able to pick the form of treatment that I truly believe will help me or help my spouse or help my child or other loved one. So that's why I think people really do stay committed to something like this and can become very emotional and very anxious when their access to something like Krebiozen is threatened.
Mhm. And there's a whole ecosystem of people around patients who are willing to support this. Like I'm thinking of the Herbert Bailey, one of the people that you talk about, who um, my understanding is he really kind of hammered home that message to patients that the FDA is interfering with your right to take this medication. And he really seemed to be encouraging and feeding that. So there's a whole ecosystem around them. So tell me more about Bailey. Where does he kind of fit in our whole rubric of good versus evil?
Yeah, and again, the good versus evil, Bailey would be another pro-Krebiozen person that uh, yeah, I would put him a little bit more on the negative side of things, but Herbert Bailey was a science he was a journalist, okay? Science and medicine writer based in Chicago. He had written articles for mainstream news publications like Collier's, which was a very big news magazine at that time, back in the 1940s and 1950s. And he became acquainted with Andrew Ivy in about 1952. Ivy said, "Look, I'm having all sorts of problems with organized medicine over this cancer drug, especially the American Medical Association." And Herbert Bailey, according to his own account, because he wrote a couple of books about pro-Krebiozen books and also a pro-Krebiozen pulp magazine, and worked as a publicist for the pro-Krebiozen sources. Herbert Bailey became a convert and had an almost evangelical zeal on behalf of this drug, not only in touting its benefits for the drug, but also going on the attack against anyone who seemed to threaten access to it. Everyone from the University of Illinois president, who would eventually lose his job over his opposition to Krebiozen, to the American Medical Association. Herbert Bailey was maybe the main figure who said that the AMA was totally corrupt and that the AMA was conspiring to kill Krebiozen only because certain nefarious figures in the AMA were trying to seize financial control of it. And in time, Bailey would move on to attack the Food and Drug Administration, the National Cancer Institute, and their officials for their opposition to Krebiozen. Um, and Bailey, later on in his life, and he kind of dropped off the radar after about the early 1990s. I'm not sure completely what happened to him, but eventually he moved on to other alternative or other non mainstream medical therapies. He was especially a proponent of vitamin E as a kind of cure all, and he wrote books talking about the supposed government conspiracy and medical conspiracy to suppress vitamin E as a cure all. This is a running theme, by the way, that goes through history back at least to the 19th century and goes on in our present moment. The fact that people who tout unproven medical devices and therapies often say the government and organized medicine and science are conspiring to suppress this miraculous cure because they don't want any challenges to their authority and they don't want any challenges to their financial control of all of medicine. And so, of course, they're going to try to argue against this treatment, the supposed miraculous treatment. And that certainly was the case with Herbert Bailey and Krebiozen.
I don't recall in the text of the book, coming across someone who we'd kind of consider as a whistleblower, someone who really kind of made it their life's work to really call out the medication and the people who are pushing it. Was there a whistleblower figure in the history of the medication?
Um, Maybe not in the classic insider whistleblower. You know, there wasn't anyone that I located who was inside the pro Krebiozen group who then, started leaking information to federal investigators or to journalists in a deep throat sort of way. Um, there were a lot of individuals working within organized science and medicine who really did try to stop this. For example, when Andrew Ivy first got involved with this drug, a lot of his esteemed medical colleagues, people he had worked with at Northwestern, people he had worked with at the University of Illinois, people he had worked with um, in the American Medical Association, were telling him, look, this drug, you don't want anything to do with it. It's not too late. Distance yourself from it. And he just refused to listen. And then as this thing went on, there were people who were inspectors and investigators for the Food and Drug Administration. One guy in particular who kept trying to see the process of this drug being manufactured in the laboratory in Chicago where the manufacturing process was supposed to happen. And Stefan Durovic, the Yugoslav doctor who brought this drug to America, he was kind of like Wile E. Coyote. The FDA inspector and the other FDA people who were working on this investigation never could pin down this Yugoslav doctor, never were able to see the whole process of the manufacture of the drug. There were people, attorneys, who were trying to put together a foolproof case, fraud case against Ivy and the Durovic brothers, and they too never were able to pin down the pro-Krebiozen people to the extent that they could win convictions. Yeah, there were a whole uh, group of people over many years who were trying to check this drug, finally put an end to the whole affair, and just couldn't do it.
It's so tough because on one hand, I totally empathize with people who are saying, let me just take this drug even if it doesn't work. And then the people who are saying it doesn't work, we shouldn't be giving it to people. And yeah, it's tough. And I'm glad for those people who tried to fight the good fight. And I have deep empathy for those people who just wanted to take the drug. Oh,
Yeah, and it really raises a difficult question that I haven't totally resolved in my mind.
mm,
When you talk about something like vaccine hesitancy, your personal choice to get vaccinated or not vaccinated, or to get your children vaccinated or not vaccinated, obviously has an impact beyond just you. But when it comes to something like a cancer medicine, whether it works or doesn't work, it's more difficult to say to someone, you should not have the right to try whatever treatment you want. um, that's where the whole notion of medical freedom becomes an issue. And it is, and again, this is an Ask Historian podcast. We're not talking too much about present events, but this is a real hot issue right now, and it's going to continue being a really hot issue. A libertarian approach to medicine and the whole question of medical freedom. And what I think have come down to is that when a person insists on not only insists on choosing a particular drug, but also that's unproven or even disproven in an organized medicine, but especially goes beyond that to attack organized medicine as being totally corrupt, and you cannot trust any of the government agencies like the FDA or the NCI or the National Institutes of Health, then you're doing real damage. And when you're condoning an enterprise that clearly is making a great deal of money for somebody somewhere where there is no real scientific evidence whatsoever that it works, then you're also doing damage.
Mhm.
And yeah, so things like Krebiozen do raise difficult questions about medical freedom, but in the long term, I fall in the camp of backing organized medicine, backing organized science, and trusting that professional scientists and doctors over time will best serve the common good.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about your book, that even though it does take place in a very particular period of time about a very particular thing, it's relevant to today. And I think it's a fast read. It's a compelling read. So it's a very enjoyable book. So I do highly recommend that, and we'll include a link to it in our show notes. So the last thing I kind of wanted
Thank
to
you.
ask you about is that the process of writing a book about history, or any book publishing with a press, it's always counted in years. It's never, a few months from proposal to publication. Is there anything that you would change to your conclusion based on anything that happened after you submitted? And did you learn anything after you submitted your final draft that you wish you could have included?
Um, Nothing major. I mean, obviously, the political situation is different today than it was even last summer when the book was published. And as I mentioned in passing, this whole question of medical freedom and mainstream medicine versus non-mainstream medicine, these are questions that are even more pertinent. So if I were to publish the book at this moment, I would probably harp on those things a little bit more. Um, there have been particular cases of unproven cancer treatments that keep popping up in the news that I would have cited if I were to publish the book today. Like a doctor who was a kidney specialist as opposed to an oncologist who was touting a blood filtering system that apparently has some value against COVID, but has no value against cancer. And he was giving this treatment for $45,000 a pop in Antigua and telling people who were taking this treatment to stop their chemotherapy. Things like that would have been worth citing. Um, there's a doctor at Harvard University who's doing placebo research, which is really interesting because people, another reason that people stayed committed to something like Krebiozen was they took it and they really did feel better. And the reason that they felt better most likely was due to the placebo effect. And the
Yeah,
placebo effect is real, it's
yeah,
scientifically proven and documented. And this doctor at Harvard, or scientist at Harvard, has been looking at ways of using the placebo effect in a transparent way. Apparently, he has found that people can knowingly take a placebo drug and still feel better. And that has really interesting implications. And the article that I was reading about this research, which was in the New York Times, it was actually a first person op-ed written by this doctor, and he ended by saying something like, "The ritual aspects of medicine and just the hopeful aspects of medicine are really, really important. Medicine needs to be able to provide hope to the people who are taking medicine in order for the necessary trust in medicine to be preserved." And so, studies like that and research like that would have been nice to cite, but the overall broad conclusions, no, I don't really think that those have changed in my mind at all.
nice, nice. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us to talk about your book, which again, I will reiterate is a great book and I highly recommend that people read it. Even if you're just interested in, the not just the medical history, but it's great Chicago history. It's it's great history about the FDA and about kind of negotiating all of those tensions. And I was sharing in our emails that I did kind of chuckle when it came down to be creatine because I'm a Gen X woman. Creatine is not getting pushed on me all the time. So now I'm like, they could have just marketed it as creatine for for people of a certain age.
Yeah.
They would have sold
Yeah,
them.
what happened was the FDA eventually did find that the samples that they were testing were mostly creatine and that it had no anti-tumor properties. So, yeah.
Nice, nice. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.